I want to talk about why we should care about the 1960 election. What was so special about that one? Secondly, I want to tell you a little bit about the major lessons I learned in my research that you can find in the book if you take the time to read it. Thirdly, I want to, if we have time, go walk you through three sort of pivotal scenes in the book. We may have to cut that down if time runs short. And then finally, I want to do some question and answers back and forth. If you have questions, I'd love to kind of get your feedback as we go through it. Well, there's a number of reasons to look at that 1960 election. First of all, you have two fascinating political characters. If you think about it, John Kennedy and Richard Nixon were two of the most brilliant political minds America produced in the 1960s. Richard Nixon was on the national ticket 5 times and won 4 out of the 5 times. And last I checked, that's a pretty good batting average, and it's one of the best batting averages of anybody who's run for the American presidency. And of course, John Kennedy, becoming the first and only a Roman Catholic president in America's history, is a very interesting story in and of himself. Secondly, it was an extraordinarily close election. Kennedy won the election by just a tick or two over 100,000 votes out of the tens of millions that were cast. And so it was extraordinarily close. It was also, I argue, really the first modern campaign. When you think about pollsters, you think about use of media, you think of mass buying of advertising, and when you think about religion as a political force, you add all of those together, and many things which we take for granted in our presidential races today in many ways began in that 1960 election. So I think it's the beginning of modern political presidential campaigns. But it was also what I call the larva stage of the religious right in the United States. If you look at who some of the players were among conservative Protestants in 1960, you see some of the leading lights of what we now call the religious right first becoming active in national politics in that election. People like Billy Graham, the National Association of Evangelicals, and a host of smaller conservative Protestant players really broke in their sweatshirts and sneakers in that election, and they discovered they had political power and that politicians cared about their opinions. And the trajectory then takes off, so that by now, certainly, the religious right is a very powerful force in American presidential politics. 1960 is where they really began to get a thirst and a taste for playing at a very large and high political level. So those are all good reasons, I think, for thinking about this election in 1960, because those themes still reverberate down to this day. Now, what did I learn in the process of writing this book? There's sort of two major lessons, although you got to read all 200 some odd pages to get the details. First of all, Kennedy had a very sophisticated approach to his Catholicism, because all of his polling told him that this would be the major problem in the American electorate's mind about whether or not they would vote for John Kennedy or not. Now, 50 years later, that strikes us as a little odd. Or in the sense that we don't tend to think of, well, I'm going to vote for that person or I'm going to vote against that person based on their religious affiliation. But in the middle of the 20th century, anti-Catholicism was alive and well in America across an incredibly broad spectrum of our society. Conservative folk, moderate folk, even liberals had a very dim view of the Roman Catholic Church in this country. So Ted Sorensen said that religion was the toughest issue they faced, and Sorensen was really kind of the brain trust inside of the Kennedy campaign. And they knew, all things being equal, they would win that election, but their one Achilles heel was the religion issue. Now, if you had grown up in Massachusetts and had run for politics, being a Catholic in the 50s and 60s was no disadvantage to getting elected to statewide office in Massachusetts, because the population is heavily Catholic. So in some sense, the Kennedy operation had never experienced the kind of anti-Catholicism that was quite common in this part of the world and further south. So they had a very steep learning curve to master. And one of the things they did is they employed a number of folk who they thought were the smartest people they could find on that issue. So they hired advisors who counseled them on how do you attack this kind of anti-Catholic bigotry. Kennedy himself actually turned to a number of Catholic leaders and had a private sort of conversation going on the side about how to deal with this issue. Now, the irony was, one of the criticisms of Kennedy was he was going to be beholden to these Catholic leaders if he became president. And had those folks learned who Kennedy was actually talking to, it would have fed their deepest and worst fears, because he was talking to Catholic leaders. Now, they weren't telling him what to do, they were giving him advice. And in many cases, he took it. In some cases, he didn't take it. But his primary political mentor within the Catholic Church was Bishop John Wright of then the Pittsburgh Diocese. Wright was actually a diocesan priest in the Boston diocese, and he had gotten to know John Kennedy immediately after World War II. Wright's career then takes off within the church, just as Kennedy's takes off within politics, and eventually Wright became the highest-ranking American in the Vatican. He was named a cardinal and was brought to Rome. But they maintained a relationship and a set of conversations where Wright was offering him advice on how to run as a Catholic for the presidency. And in the book, I discovered archival material no one else has found that goes into great detail about that relationship and the kind of advice that Kennedy had. So Kennedy applied what I call a kind of technical rationality to this problem. He didn't fully understand why his Catholicism was a problem in places like Texas or Tennessee or Alabama or Mississippi, but he employed the resources he could find to understand it, and then he tried to address the issues that got identified as he talked to these advisors. And so you see a kind of dexterity of policy and action in Kennedy's mind. And when he found the problem, he said, well, who are the best people in the world we can bring to help us with that problem? And then he took their advice. And in the end, I argue, it was that advice that allowed him to win the election and to triumph over these more conservative Protestant forces. The second thing I learned was actually that, surprise, surprise, Richard Nixon had an anti-Catholic strategy. You know, in retrospect, we're perhaps not surprised by that revelation. But as you look at some of the standard accounts of the 1960 race, Nixon always said, I am not going to raise the religion of my opponent in this election. Now, there was a certain Nixonian valence to that. Even the Sunday night before the general election, Nixon bought, I think it was a half hour of primetime television. And he reminded his audience yet again, I am not going to raise the religion of my opponent in this election, subtly reminding you that if you had a problem with him being Catholic, he is in fact a Catholic, and so please be reminded when you go to the polls in 2 days. But beyond this public denial, and it's true, Nixon did not publicly exploit the issue other than these kind of odd throwaway lines in a lot of his speeches. He, in fact, had an on-the-ground strategy of organizing conservative ministers, sometimes from the Southern Baptist Church, from the National Association of Evangelicals, the Churches of Christ, and other groups, such that millions of pieces of literature were circulated on behalf of the Nixon campaign during the course of that campaign, because Nixon had one operative in the field, off of the books and below the radar screen, going around organizing these forces on the ground. And there were a couple of national meetings, one in Washington, D.C., and others in different places, where they tried to organize leaders in these faith communities to go out and turn out the vote against Kennedy because he was a Catholic. So by the end of the election, almost every leading religious public figure of the day cuts across the story somewhere. Billy Graham is deeply involved in helping Nixon win. Norman Vincent Peale is deeply involved. The National Association of Evangelicals is deeply involved. An organization that was called Protestants and Other Americans United for Separation of Church and State was deeply involved in organizing. They're now known as Americans United for Separation of Church and State. They've sort of secularized or cut off the kind of religious part of their message. But early on, they were one of the strongest anti-Catholic voices in America in the 40s and 50s. And they went all in for Richard Nixon and against John Kennedy. And they worked with the Nixon campaign against him. So those are sort of the two basic things that I learned as we go through that campaign. I'm going to read a couple of passages. Let me point you to 3 scenes, and we'll see how far we get in these. But one of them has to do with Billy Graham's work on behalf of Nixon and against Kennedy. The second one, which we'll probably skip over, is a vignette from Kennedy's famous Houston speech, where there was this crisis late in the campaign where he felt like he had to go and speak in front of a group of Protestant ministers, and he went to Houston. And the last one is actually set here in Nashville, Tennessee, where one of the most prominent clergymen in Nashville at the time, Batsell Barrett Baxter, who was an icon in the Churches of Christ, preached an anti-Catholic sermon and then had a U.S. congressman get up in the pulpit and rebut the sermon immediately after it was delivered. Which you can imagine, both the Banner and the Tennessean had front-page stories on Monday, just the outrageous violation of all kinds of Southern taboos, you know, getting up and rebutting an iconic preacher like this in his own pulpit was really quite extraordinary. So I'll probably do that one and this one about Billy Graham. So let me just take a moment